Chapter 1. A sting in the afternoon. It was a peculiarly warm afternoon for early spring in the village of Meddenham St. Mary, a quaint little dot of hedgerows, ivy-covered chimneys, and lace-curtained windows. At the edge of the village, just beyond the narrow stone bridge over Mill Beck, stood the beekeeper's lodge, a charming old cottage half sunken in golden primrose and buzzing life. Once a modest gamekeeper's hut, it had been lovingly restored by its latest occupant, Mr. Lionel Prothero, a semi-retired naturalist and former lecturer who had settled there after a quiet, unremarkable career abroad. His love of bees, solitude, and meticulous record-keeping were known to the whole village, and gossiped about over endless cups of tea. On this particular Sunday, a gathering had been arranged, a tea in honor of the new vicar's arrival, hosted, in the back garden of the beekeeper's lodge. The lodge's sprawling lawn, shadowed by an ancient pear tree and bordered by well-tended hives, had never looked more welcoming. There were little tables spread with embroidered cloths, trays of cucumber sandwiches, and pitchers of elderflower cordial. Miss Marple sat beneath a striped sun umbrella, a cup of milky tea in one hand, and a piece of seed cake on her plate, though she had barely touched either. Her pale blue eyes were narrowed, not in suspicion but with quiet curiosity, scanning the garden with the patient attention of one who had long ago learned that people always showed more than they meant to. "Such a peaceful setting," murmured Mrs. Banbury Finch, seated beside her. "One might almost forget the wickedness that exists in the world." Miss Marple gave a soft hum. "One might, though one ought not, I think." The new vicar, Reverend Chiswell, was attempting a spirited conversation with a gaggle of older ladies, while his rather nervous wife poured tea with trembling hands. Lionel Prothero, lean and leathery, was talking animatedly about the behavioral cycles of drones and queen bees to an uninterested Colonel Hargreaves, who kept glancing longingly at the pastries. Mrs. Sybil Crowcombe, the postmistress and a natural collector of village secrets, flitted from group to group with the grace of a woman who believed information to be a kind of currency. It was precisely the kind of event Meddenham St. Mary loved best, genteel, sunny, and rich with social nuance. But then it happened. The scream came from the orchard side of the garden, sharp, sudden, and silencing. A tremble passed through the gathering like a dropped pebble in a still pond. A maid, young Elsie, recently employed by Prothero, had stumbled out of the low hedgerow path, her apron stained, and her face deathly pale. He's dead," she gasped. "Sir, Mr. Prothero, he's in the shed. There was a mad scramble. Chairs overturned, Colonel Hargreaves swore, and Reverend Chiswell dropped his teacup with a shatter. Mrs. Crowcombe put a hand to her chest, clearly torn between horror and excitement. Miss Marple did not rise immediately. She waited, watching the rush of bodies toward the small bee shed beyond the hives. Then, in a single smooth motion, she set her cup down and reached for her parasol. Some 20 minutes later, the garden was cordoned off. Constable Merricks, young and often over-eager, had been dispatched from the station. The body of Mr. Lionel Prothero lay just inside the shed's open door, slumped awkwardly over his own hive notes. The telltale hum of disturbed bees filled the air, agitated and uneasy. There was no obvious wound, no sign of violence. But the look on his face, frozen mid-grimace, eyes wide with terror, suggested something far more sinister than natural death. Miss Marple stood at a careful distance, looking not at the corpse but at the people gathered around it, their expressions, their silences, and what they chose to say first. "Most odd," she murmured, almost to herself. "Most odd indeed." And in that moment, she knew. Something unnatural had occurred in the beekeeper's lodge, something that would sting far deeper than anyone yet suspected. Chapter 2. The Village Whispers by Evening. The lanes of Meddenham St. Mary were thick with speculation. Word of Mr. Prothero's death had spread as quickly and efficiently as if it had been delivered in a special edition of the Times. Though Constable Merricks had done his best to keep people away from the beekeeper's lodge, the sudden presence of an ambulance, 2 plain police cars, and the rigid silence of a roped-off crime scene had done more to provoke curiosity than to contain it. At the Blue Boar Inn, the front parlor buzzed with theories. At the post office, Mrs. Crocombe leaned over the counter and confided in hushed tones to every customer who passed through. Even the grocer's boy, normally sullen and indifferent, was seen breathlessly recounting what he saw with his own eyes by the orchard hedge, even though he had never left his bicycle that morning. Miss Marple, however, remained at home. She sat by the fire in her neat little drawing room at Ivy Cottage, knitting steadily, a pale green cardigan for her niece's newest child, while her mind ticked along, silently sifting impressions. The scream, the maid's terror, the odd stillness of the bee shed, the way Mrs. Crocombe had immediately looked toward Colonel Hargreaves instead of the body. All these details fluttered through her mind like pieces of a puzzle still scattered, yet vaguely taking shape. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock came on her front door. It was Constable Merrick's. His cap was slightly askew and his cheeks were flushed, not from exertion but from discomfort. He was not accustomed to visiting Miss Marple's cottage for anything beyond the collection of charity envelopes or the annual harvest raffle. "Evenin', Miss Marple," he said, clearing his throat. "Hope I'm not disturbin'. Only, Inspector Cray wants to speak with you." "Oh," she said gently, setting her knitting aside. "That seems very serious, Harold." He colored further at the use of his first name. "Well, only that. You were, there, at the garden party." "I was indeed," she said, "and very nearly had a second slice of Mrs. Chiswell's Battenberg before everything changed." Merrick's nodded and gestured to the path. "Inspector's waitin' at the lodge. Thought he might ask you a few questions, being a witness and all." "Of course," Miss Marple said, already reaching for her gloves and hat. "It would be quite wrong of me not to be helpful. Inspector." Elias Cray was not a stranger to Medmenham St. Mary. He had been stationed in nearby Brackminster for nearly 8 years and had investigated in that time exactly 2 burglaries, 1 suspicious fire, and the matter of Mr. Clifton's dog mysteriously going blind after eating something unusual from the vicarage bin. None of these had prepared him for murder. He was a stocky man in his early 50s with short gray hair and the kind of gaze that lingered too long on your mouth when you spoke, as though weighing not just your words, but how you chewed them. He greeted Miss Marple with the guarded politeness of someone who had been warned. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said as she arrived at the lodge garden. The once charming grounds now felt eerily still. The tables and tea things had been cleared, but the atmosphere of disruption lingered like pollen in the air. "Thank you for coming." "I understand you wanted to speak with me," she replied, her tone pleasant. Cray nodded toward the bench near the rose trellis. "Shall we sit?" Once they had done so, he began, notebook in hand. "You were here when the incident occurred?" "Yes. I had just finished my tea." "Did you notice anything unusual in Mr. Prothero's behavior?" Miss Marple's lips pursed in thought. He seemed distracted, animated certainly when discussing his bees, but that was not unusual. He did, however, glance more than once at Mrs. Crocombe during his speech about queen bees. Cray raised a brow. "Mrs. Crocombe?" "Yes." He remarked that queen bees can be ruthless when deposing rivals. Quite pointedly, Cray made a note, and when the scream was heard, most people rushed forward. Colonel Hargreaves dropped his scone. Mrs. Chiswell tried to block the maid from the shed, perhaps instinct, perhaps alarm. I waited, then approached once the others had crowded around. "What did you see?" Mr. Prothero's body was just inside the shed, leaning over his writing desk. There was no visible wound, but his face, well, it suggested fear. Cray tapped his pen. "Yes, the doctor noted signs consistent with cardiac arrest. However, the cause is under review. There are peculiarities." Miss Marple didn't inquire further. She simply folded her hands in her lap. "Did Mr. Prothero have enemies?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Not enemies, perhaps. But he was not universally loved. He was a man of precision. One might say stubbornness and He had recently taken to recording rather intimate village observations in a kind of naturalist's diary. He believed that human behavior could be studied like bee colonies. Some found that charming, others less so. Do you know if he had arguments with anyone lately? There was a quarrel 2 weeks ago with young Thomas Debenham, who leases the Southfield. Something to do with pesticide use near the hives. Mr. Prothero was very strict about that, and there was another, quieter dispute with Mrs. Crocombe about an anonymous letter. Cray's pen paused mid-stroke. Anonymous letter? Oh yes, Miss Marple said, almost idly. Mrs. Crocombe had mentioned at bridge last week that she'd received a very nasty note accusing her of tampering with pension forms. She was quite distressed. Cray made a sound in his throat. And you believe Mr. Prothero sent it? I couldn't say. But he did have a rather steady hand and a flair for moral instruction. Cray closed his notebook. Thank you, Miss Marple. You've been enlightening. She stood. I do hope so. By the time Miss Marple returned to Ivy Cottage, the shadows had lengthened and the primroses in her front garden had closed for the night. She moved through her home quietly, setting her gloves on the hall table, lighting a small lamp, and returning to her knitting basket. But she did not pick up the needles. Instead, she sat for a moment quite still. Her face bore no trace of alarm, no anxiety, only a deep, reflective quiet. Someone had wanted Lionel Prothero silenced. And somewhere, perhaps in a petty grudge or a bit of gossip spoken too freely, the answer was already waiting to be seen. She would wait, watch, and, like the bees Mr. Prothero had so loved, observe every subtle twitch of human nature that drifted past. The next morning, she felt certain, would bring more than the post. Chapter 3. Of Bees and Rumors by the following. Morning. The tranquil rhythms of Meddenham St. Mary had been replaced by a charged stillness, as if the whole village were holding its breath. At the grocer's, customers lingered by the tinned peaches just a bit longer than necessary, listening intently for the latest whisper. In the churchyard, the few who wandered past paused near the yew trees, casting knowing glances at the beekeeper's lodge in the distance. It had become a fixed point in every conversation, every raised eyebrow, every cautious nod. At the post office, a queue had formed unusually early, even though Mrs. Crocombe insisted there had been no new developments. She said this with just enough firmness to imply there had been, but that she, unlike others, would not indulge in hearsay, cardiac. Arrest, she repeated for the third time as she weighed Mrs. Hemmings's parcel. That's the word. Sudden but not suspicious. The doctor said so. Mrs. Hemmings frowned. But they say his face. Yes, yes, his expression, Mrs. Crocombe cut in. People die in all sorts of alarming ways. It doesn't mean someone helped them along, does it? From the back of the queue, Mr. Giles, the schoolmaster, muttered, Depends who's helping. Miss Marple, who had come in quietly for her stamps and a small bag of barley sugar, said nothing. She smiled politely at those who noticed her, received 2 pitying looks and 1 conspiratorial wink, and made her way out again. As she walked back toward the village green, she paused beneath the old elm tree near the duck pond, gazing toward the lodge. Even from this distance, she could just make out the faint glint of sunlight off the brass latch on the bee shed's door. Something about that angle, something about the shed's location, had been turning over in her mind since yesterday. Not the shed itself, she thought, but who had easy access to it? Who knew the layout intimately? Who might have had reason to be there before the party? Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. Well, I must say it's shaken us all to the bone. It was Mrs. Diana Chiswell, the vicar's wife, approaching with her usual slightly hurried gait. She carried a wicker basket, half filled with newly gathered rosemary and rhubarb. I still can't believe it, she continued, falling into step beside Miss Marple. Poor Mr. Prothero. Lionel. Such a peculiar man, but not unpleasant. Simply intense. Yes, Miss Marple said mildly. Quite particular, I thought. Mrs. Chiswell nodded. Indeed, and so disciplined about his routines. Bees at Dawn tea at 4, records every evening. He said they brought him peace, but I often wondered if he wasn't keeping score on the whole village. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. You think he was watching people? Oh, quite. I mean, not maliciously. More like an old school teacher or a judge at a flower show, always evaluating. She hesitated, and sometimes disapproving. He told me only last week that he'd seen Mrs. Crocombe receiving a strange visitor by the rear post door after hours. Said it was most improper for a civil servant. Miss Marple stopped walking. Did he now? Oh yes, said Mrs. Chisvel, eyes gleaming with nervous interest. And he asked me, quite pointedly, if I believed all of our public officials behaved as they ought. Miss Marple smiled. Did you tell him what you believed? I changed the subject, Mrs. Chiswell said primly. Rhubarb's in season. After all, they parted ways soon after, but Miss Marple didn't immediately return home. Instead, she walked the longer route past the lodge, where the gate now bore a sign reading, Police Investigation, No Admittance. She lingered outside the hedgerow path and noted something that struck her as odd. One of the beehives had been moved slightly, just a few inches back, and there were faint impressions in the grass nearby. Someone had stepped there recently. Perhaps not the constable. Perhaps before the scream. Just then, the voice of young Elsie broke the stillness. Oh, Miss Marple. The maid, her apron streaked, and her hair pinned in disarray, hurried up the path with a small bundle of laundry and a flustered look. I didn't mean to startle you, ma'am. I've just been to Mrs. Tilling's. She lets me use her mangle on Tuesdays. Miss Marple smiled. Quite all right, Elsie. I imagine things have been rather difficult. Elsie hesitated, then nodded. It's awful quiet in the lodge now. Like the house is waiting. And the bees are all restless. They know, don't they? Animals always know. Indeed, Miss Marple said. Tell me, dear, on the afternoon of the tea were you asked to tidy the shed? Elsie's face paled slightly. Yes, ma'am, that morning. Mr. Prothero said it needed dusting, and he gave me a little list of things to straighten. Told me not to touch the drawer, though. Said he had private field notes in there. And did you see anyone go in afterward? Elsie looked uncomfortable. I thought I saw someone from the orchard side, just a glimpse, a shadow. I thought maybe it was Colonel Hargreaves, but I wasn't sure. He wears those thick-soled shoes. I remember hearing them on the gravel. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Did you mention this to the inspector? Elsie shook her head quickly. No, ma'am. I didn't want to cause trouble, and I don't know it was him. Quite right not to assume, said Miss Marple, gently. But sometimes even uncertain things can be helpful, especially when spoken kindly. She left Elsie with a warm nod and resumed her walk. It was all coming together now. The peculiar glance at Mrs. Crocombe, the missing letter, the bee's unusual agitation, the careful list forbidding a maid to open a drawer. A picture was forming, not clear, not yet, but with sharper edges than the day before. Back at Ivy Cottage, she poured herself a fresh cup of tea and opened her rosewood writing box. Inside were several tidy envelopes, a pair of spectacles, and a folded bit of pink notepaper bearing a single phrase in her own elegant hand. Observe the way a person avoids a truth. There is often more in that than in what they confess. She laid it beside her cup and settled in. Tomorrow, she thought, would bring new questions, and if she was right, someone in Medmenham St. Mary would very soon make a mistake. Chapter 4. The first suspect by Wednesday morning, Inspector Cray had made what the village referred to as a move. That is to say, he had summoned Colonel Bertram Hargreaves to Typhoonwinter, the police station in Brackminster, for what he called a formal discussion. Naturally, such phrasing did little to prevent speculation. It only stirred it more vigorously. Outside the station, as the colonel's chauffeur-driven Morris pulled away, a boy on a bicycle sped down the lane to deliver the news to the Blue Boar, where it promptly spread to the bakery, then to the hairdresser's, and finally, by way of Mrs. Leach, a woman with an unmatched speed for relaying scandal, to every doorstep in Medmenham St. Mary before noon. The colonel, it was whispered, had been seen lingering near the bee shed before the scream. He was drinking rather a lot of gin at the garden party, muttered Mr. Giles at the greengrocer's. Said Prothero was a pompous old jackass just the week before. Didn't he once lose a fortune on some colonial stocks? Asked Mrs. Hemmings. Precisely, replied Mrs. Crowcombe, who had somehow insinuated herself into the middle of the exchange. And Mr. Prothero advised the vicar to reconsider parish funds shortly after. It's practically public knowledge. Of it, of course, reached Miss Marple. She was sitting beneath her garden's lilac boughs, a cushion beneath her lower back, knitting resting in her lap, while her mind ticked along like a finely tuned watch. She had not been surprised to hear of Colonel Hargreaves's questioning. His was the easiest thread to tug. A man with a known temper, a stiff military bearing, and a long-standing dislike of the victim was precisely the sort of suspect that satisfied the village's thirst for resolution, but easy answers were rarely true ones. That afternoon, Miss Marple took it upon herself to call on the colonel at his residence, Fernhill Grange. She arrived with a jar of crabapple jelly and a box of lemon biscuits, social currency in Meddenham St. Mary, and was received, after a brief delay, in the drawing room where the colonel stood stiffly, hands clasped behind his back like a man who'd been ordered to wait out a court-martial. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, managing a brief nod. "Very kind of you. I'm afraid you've caught me in something of a mood." "I should imagine so," she replied gently. "Being called in for questioning must be most unpleasant." It was blasted ridiculous is what it was. He crossed to the drinks cabinet and poured himself a modest sherry. "Cray's convinced I had some sort of grand quarrel with Prothero. Nonsense. We had our differences, yes, but the idea that I'd murder him? Utterly absurd." Miss Marple accepted her sherry with a nod. "Yet people do kill for less than we often suppose." He snorted. "Prothero and I argued. About stocks, yes, but it wasn't personal. He was an interfering man, but he thought he was helping. Too clever by half. Do you remember where you were just before the scream?" He blinked. "Good heavens, Marple. Are you interrogating me now?" "Not at all," she said mildly. "I find the movement of people at gatherings to be quite fascinating. I often notice little things. For instance, the way your shoes press into the gravel. Very distinctive, you know." Colonel Hargreaves looked at her sharply, then sat down. I stepped aside for a moment. Needed a smoke. I walked toward the orchard path. I didn't go in the shed, if that's what you're implying. I may have looked toward it. Prothero was fussing with something inside. "But you didn't speak?" "No," he said gruffly. "Didn't get the chance." Miss Marple sipped her sherry. "And you didn't see anyone else nearby?" "No one, just the hum of the bees." She waited, noting the tremor in his right hand, the stiffness in his shoulders. Fear, not of guilt perhaps, but of accusation, had settled on him like pollen. She decided not to press further. "I shall take my leave," she said gently, placing the biscuit tin on the table. "The lemon ones are from a new recipe. You'll find them sharper than expected." On her way back, Miss Marple stopped at the lodge. The police tape had been removed, and the door to the bee shed was now padlocked. But the garden had been left undisturbed. Hives still buzzed quietly, orderly and intent. She stooped to examine the flattened grass once more, her eyes narrowing. She counted the steps, 5 paces from the back hedge to the edge of the bee shed, and measured the depth of one heel mark, larger than hers, wider, a man's step almost certainly, but not necessarily the colonel's. She turned her attention to the rear of the property. There, nestled just beyond the garden border, was a compost bin, half covered by an old tarpaulin. She lifted the edge carefully, revealing wilted leaves, tea grounds, and the unmistakable gleam of metal. A small canister. It bore no label. Its nozzle was capped, but its size and shape were familiar. Miss Marple had seen similar ones used by gardeners, often to spray pesticides. She replaced the tarp and stood very still. Pesticides and bees. Prothero had been known to rage about them. He had accused several locals of irresponsible use. Perhaps it had been more than academic. Perhaps someone had tried to silence his complaint before it grew teeth. Back at Ivy Cottage, she reviewed her mental ledger. Colonel Hargreaves. Motive, yes. Opportunity, perhaps. Temperament, questionable. But somehow it all felt too clear. Mrs. Crocombe, a secret visitor, a damaging letter, a reputation to protect. Young Debenham, barely mentioned so far, but pesticides near the hives could be his doing. Miss Marple sighed. The village had begun circling Colonel Hargreaves like bees around a jam pot. But sometimes she knew the most dangerous bee wasn't the one buzzing loudest. It was the one waiting in silence. Tomorrow she would pay a visit to someone whose name had been suspiciously absent from all gossip. Young Thomas Debenham, and she would listen, not to what he said, but to what he avoided saying. Chapter 5. The Field with No Flowers. The Debenham farm lay at the far eastern edge of Meddenham St. Mary, where the land sloped gently down toward the Weald and the hedges turned. Wilder, flecked with cow parsley and hawthorn, though not large by county standards, it had been in the family for generations, and young Thomas Debenham, barely 30, had inherited it from his father just 3 years prior. Miss Marple, ever punctual and deliberate, arrived on Thursday morning. A light breeze played through the wheat stalks as she approached the red-bricked farmhouse. The place had an air of unpolished resilience, functional, orderly, but not particularly loved. Thomas himself opened the door. He was a tall young man with a sun-weathered face, quick brown eyes, and the kind of defensive energy that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else than answering a knock from the village's most unassuming interrogator. "Miss Marple," he said warily. "I wasn't expecting company." "No, I dare say not," she smiled. "But then, no one expects me until I'm already there." She held up a parcel wrapped in waxed paper. "Apple tart. I thought you might like one. Mrs. Leach swears yours is the only house in the village that never bakes." He blinked, unsure whether he was being teased. "Well, thank you." He stepped aside to let her in. The kitchen was utilitarian and spotless, save for a pile of unopened letters and a broken radio sitting on the windowsill. "I shan't take much of your time," Miss Marple said as she settled herself into a wooden chair by the hearth. "Only, I've been thinking a great deal about bees." Thomas's back stiffened slightly as he busied himself with plates. "Mr. Prothero's bees?" "Just so. I understand you and he had a disagreement about spraying." His jaw tightened. "I don't see how it concerns anyone. It's my land, and what I do with it is my affair." "Oh, indeed. But when bees begin to die, it becomes everyone's concern, doesn't it? One dead bee is a fluke. A dozen is a pattern." He set the plates down with a little too much force. "Look, I've already spoken to the inspector. I didn't kill Prothero. He was a nuisance, sure, always sticking his nose in other people's affairs, writing letters to the parish council. But he was alive the last time I saw him, swore at me through the hedge and marched off in a huff. That was a week before the party." Miss Marple sipped the tea he had poured. It was oversteeped, but hot. "May I ask if you ever went to his garden? Perhaps on the day of the gathering?" "No," he said quickly. "I wasn't invited. Never would be." "Still," she said gently, "it's quite possible to pass by that end of the village if one were taking a shortcut from the Weald, wouldn't you say?" Thomas's eyes flickered. "Maybe. And yet," she went on, her voice softening, "Mr. Prothero's compost bin contains a canister, an unlabeled one, very similar to the kind used in crop spraying." He paled. You went snooping?" "I looked. That is all." Her eyes rested on him calmly. "But it raises the question. If the hives were suffering, and someone meant to silence the man trying to expose it, well, the motive writes itself." He stood now, pacing slightly. "He was going to ruin me. Write the paper, send it to the agricultural board. I'd have lost my subsidy. But you didn't kill him." He stopped. "No, I didn't." Miss Marple let the silence settle before adding, "Not everyone with a motive has the heart. Sometimes it's the one who thinks everyone else deserves what's coming that makes the move." He looked down, biting his lip. "He did say something strange last time I saw him." "Oh," Thomas exhaled. "Said he'd discovered something more distasteful than pesticide. Something about a rot at the root, and that it wasn't the bees he'd be writing about after all." Then he laughed. "I didn't understand it at the time. I thought he meant me. But maybe someone else was the true subject," Miss Marple finished softly. On her walk back, Miss Marple turned these words over in her mind. A rot at the root. Not literal, surely. Figurative. A corruption of some kind. A hidden truth. Perhaps a betrayal. Back in the village square, the sun was high, and the war memorial cast long, sharp shadows. Miss Marple stopped at the stationer's, ostensibly to purchase ink, but in reality to observe the comings and goings of the post office across the way. At 10 minutes past 12, Mrs. Crocombe emerged in a lilac coat, her handbag clutched tightly. She looked neither left nor right. Miss Marple waited until she had passed, then followed her at a polite distance, noticing the woman's posture, rigid, determined, and the direction of her steps. Not homeward, as one might expect. Instead, Mrs. Crocombe turned onto Millthorpe Lane past the vicarage and ducked into the side gate of a small cottage once owned by the late Miss Fenton. A vacant cottage. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. Why would a postmistress visit an empty house in the middle of her workday? Curious, she returned home and did something she rarely indulged in. She placed a call to her nephew Raymond, who had once, over a rather heated Christmas pudding, explained to her the delicate uses of public records. Within the hour, she had what she needed. The deed to Miss Fenton's cottage had recently been transferred to one Edgar Willard Crocombe, a name she had not heard spoken in Meddenham St. Mary in over 2 decades, and yet here it was, bold and legal, Mrs. Crocombe's husband, long presumed deceased, or at least gone. And just like that, Miss Marple felt the bees begin to stir again. A man who had vanished, a woman with a secret, a victim who knew more than he was meant to. She folded her notes and tucked them into her sewing kit, letting the details nestle beneath the spools and needles like pollen in a hive. It was time, she thought, to pay Mrs. Crocombe a visit, and this time she would not ask about the mail. Chapter 6. Secrets Behind the Stamp. Drawer by Friday. Morning. Miss Marple's mind was a careful weave of connections, each thread examined and gently tucked into place. The picture, though still incomplete, had begun to show form. A death without visible violence, a village tangled in rivalries and whispered histories, and a postmistress whose personal story did not match her public one. At precisely 10 o'clock, Miss Marple arrived at the post office, not to buy stamps, nor to send a letter, but to pay a visit of a more deliberate nature. The bell above the door jingled, and she was greeted by the familiar scent of paper, glue, and old wood polish. A queue of 2 stood ahead, both fussing over minor parcels and misprinted addresses, giving her just enough time to observe Mrs. Crocombe behind the counter. She was as brisk as ever, but her face bore the faint pallor of someone not sleeping. Well. Her smile to customers was tight-lipped, and her fingers fumbled ever, so slightly as she reached for change. "Miss Marple," she said with practiced warmth as her turn came. "How nice. Just in for a bit of stationery?" "Not quite," Miss Marple said sweetly. "I was hoping you might spare me a few minutes of conversation." Mrs. Crocombe's hands paused. "Of course, if it's not too long. I've got the ledger to update before midday. I promise not to keep you." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "I wanted to ask you about your husband." There was a moment of stillness. Then, "I'm a widow, as you well know." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "But there appears to be some confusion at the land registry. It seems Mr. Edgar Willard Crocombe has taken possession of Miss Fenton's cottage, recently." The color drained from Mrs. Crocombe's cheeks, then surged back in a blotchy rush. "What? I don't know what you're implying. Miss Marple's expression was soft but unyielding. You were seen entering that cottage yesterday, a locked property, one listed under your husband's name. It occurred to me that Mr. Prothero, who so enjoyed keeping track of local inconsistencies, may have noticed as well. Mrs. Crocombe turned sharply, checking to ensure no one else had entered. The room was momentarily empty. Her voice, when she spoke, was lower and uncharacteristically raw. He came back 6 months ago, Edgar, after 21 years. Alive. All this time? Yes. He left me. Disappeared after some business with forged investments. I told everyone he died abroad. It was easier. I rebuilt my life. I took the position at the post office. Earned trust. Earned standing. And now? She exhaled. He returned with demands. Claimed the cottage. Said he had rights. I was terrified someone would see him. If the village knew I'd lied? Miss Marple waited. Did Mr. Prothero see him? I think so. He never confronted me directly, but last week he began making pointed comments about ghosts returning and double lives. Then he left an envelope in my pigeonhole. No name, just a single note. She pulled a folded slip of paper from the drawer beneath the stamps and handed it to Miss Marple. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, angular, precise. One sting is survivable. A swarm may kill. I suggest you speak before the hive turns. Miss Marple read the note twice before placing it in her handbag. Did you show this to the police? Of course not, Mrs. Crocombe snapped. What could I say? I've built everything on silence. I have a pension now, a home, respect. I couldn't lose it all. You mean you wouldn't? Miss Marple corrected gently. Mrs. Crocombe's eyes flashed, then filled with unshed tears. He was going to expose me. Yes, Miss Marple said. But exposure is not the same as murder. She left soon, after declining a cup of tea, and walked toward the cottage on Millthorpe Lane. It looked undisturbed, windows shuttered, no sign of movement. But if Edgar Crocombe truly was there, then he too had cause to silence a man like Lionel Prothero. Miss Marple made a note to return later that evening, perhaps with a question or two best asked under cover of dusk. Back at Ivy Cottage, a knock sounded just before lunch. It was Inspector Cray, hat in hand and his face unusually tight. Miss Marple, he said, I believe we've made a discovery. She gestured him inside, already sensing the import of his visit. We've had the contents of Prothero's desk examined. Hidden beneath the false bottom of a drawer was a bundle of notes, observations, character sketches. He was writing a kind of anthropological record of the village. I suspected as much, Miss Marple murmured. But more than that, he had compiled allegations, names, dates, photographs, including one of Mrs. Crocombe with a man we believed to be her husband, dated 2 weeks ago, at the cottage. And the cause of death? Cray looked grim. The toxicology came back, not natural causes. He was administered a dose of amitraz, a pesticide commonly used in bee mite control, ingested, most likely through his tea, lethal in high enough quantities. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup. Cray continued. We found a teacup in the shed, separate from those used in the garden, not part of the tea service. Someone made a second cup, a private one. I see, she said quietly. Then the killer had access to the shed, to the compound, and knew his routine. Exactly. The problem is nearly anyone could have slipped inside. The garden was open, people mingling. Not quite anyone, Miss Marple said, eyes distant. The maid told me she was told not to touch the drawer. Mr. Prothero knew something dangerous was inside. He had begun to fear retaliation. The note to Mrs. Crocombe wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Cray leaned forward. You think she didn't write the letter that caused his death? No, said Miss Marple. But someone else read it. Someone who feared being named in those files. Someone who knew about pesticides. And how much was too much. She stood, suddenly firm. It is time, Inspector, that I had a few words with Thomas Debenham's sister. Cray blinked. His sister. Indeed, Miss Marple said, already reaching for her gloves. You see, she runs the apiary in his absence, and I believe she knows far more about poison than she ever let on. Chapter 7. The Apiarist's Calm. The Debenham apiary was tucked behind the far orchard, a quiet patch of cultivated wilderness, where the buzz of bees hummed like a heartbeat against the wind. It was smaller than Mr. Prothero's setup, only 4 hives in total, but neatly kept, with painted boxes in soft green and blue, and a tidy shed filled with tools, jars, and labeled tinctures. Miss Marple arrived late that Friday afternoon, her hat pinned tight against the breeze and her walking stick tapping softly against the path as she approached. She was met at the gate by a tall, calm-faced woman in her early 40s, with sun-worn skin, steady eyes, and a voice like honey poured over stone. "Miss Marple," said Lydia Debenham, wiping her hands on a canvas cloth. "I thought it was only a matter of time before you visited." "You expected me? I heard about your visit to Thomas, and the constable asked questions about our pesticide use this morning." Lydia shrugged. "Not hard to add 2 and 2. Do come in. I've just finished a batch of comb frames." The interior of the apiary shed was immaculate. Wooden boxes stacked in one corner, a kettle warming on a small stove, and the scent of beeswax thick in the air. On one side, a row of small bottles lined the shelf, labels in careful cursive: lavender infusion, camphor oil, formic acid, amitraz, 25%. Miss Marple's eyes flicked briefly to the last one. "Your hives are thriving," she said politely. "They are better than Prothero's, I'm afraid." His bees had become restless, agitated. It happens sometimes when a keeper changes routine or disturbs the balance. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but his death was not the work of nature." Lydia Debenham turned, her expression unreadable. "You're certain?" "The police. Our amitraz administered deliberately, likely in tea. His personal teacup was found, one not served from the public tray." Lydia nodded slowly. "Then someone knew his patterns very well. He was a creature of habit." "Yes, Miss Marple, I said, which narrows the field." A quiet settled between them. Lydia reached for a jar of honey and handed it to Miss Marple. "Early spring batch, heather and clover. You'll like it." Miss Marple took it with a nod of thanks, but her gaze remained steady. "Tell me, Miss Debenham, you were present at the garden party?" "I was. Came with Thomas. Though I kept mostly to myself, and yet no one recalled seeing you during the interval when Mr. Prothero left the group." Lydia's lips twitched, but not in amusement. "I stepped away. I'm not fond of crowds. Too much perfume muddles my sense of scent. I prefer being with the bees." "Then you would have had the chance," Miss Marple said gently, "to visit the shed, perhaps even to prepare something." "I didn't poison him," Lydia said flatly. "Though heaven knows I didn't like the man. He had a gift for turning good people sour. He called me reckless once, said I handled mites like a chemist with a blindfold. But I respected him. In a way." Miss Marple set down the honey jar and moved to the shelf, her finger gently tapping one of the smaller unlabeled bottles. "Do you store your pesticides here?" "Only in small doses," Lydia replied. "We don't need much." "And did Thomas ever access this shed?" "Rarely. He leaves the bees to me. He's more comfortable with tractors and invoices." Miss Marple turned back to her. "But he'd have known where you kept the chemicals." "Yes." "Did he ever take any?" A pause. "Once," Lydia said. "A year ago. Said he needed to treat a batch quickly and I was away in Brackminster. I didn't ask questions." Miss Marple's brow creased faintly. "That's unlike you, I think." Lydia's eyes sharpened. "Why are you really here, Miss Marple?" "To ask one final question," she said. "You see, I believe Mr. Prothero discovered something. Something dangerous, something rotten, as he told young Thomas. And I think he wrote about it." Lydia folded her arms. "You think I'm part of it?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "you're someone who notices everything, keeps her head down, and protects what she must. The question is, what were you protecting? Your brother? Or someone else? Lydia didn't answer at once. She poured tea from the kettle into two mismatched mugs. Do you know what it's like, she said slowly, to watch your family work themselves into the ground for a piece of land that barely yields enough to pay the bills? To be told by the parish council you're not eligible for the agricultural bonus because of some technicality? Prothero advocated for that disqualification, said Thomas was careless with records, said we were wasting subsidies. Miss Marple nodded. And that might breed resentment. Lydia's voice was cold. Yes, but it doesn't breed murder. Miss Marple, I took the mug offered to her but did not drink. I believe you, she said at last. I believe you didn't poison him. But I also believe you know who might have. Lydia's expression didn't change, but her knuckles whitened on the mug. It wasn't Thomas, she said finally. He's foolish, not violent, but someone else was around that shed, someone who shouldn't have been. I heard them, heavy steps, sharp coughing, not my brother's gait, not mine, and not yours, I'd wager. Then whose? Miss Marple asked. Lydia looked down. There was one man who still visited the lodge without announcing it, who had reasons to hate Prothero, reasons both old and new. You should ask Mrs. Crocombe again. Miss Marple blinked. Her husband? Lydia nodded. Edgar Crocombe. The name hung in the air like a disturbed swarm. You think he's still in the village? Lydia hesitated. I think he never left it. Miss Marple set down her untouched tea. There it was, the sting beneath the surface. If Edgar Crocombe had returned and Prothero had uncovered his deception, the motive was no longer resentment, but desperation. Not a scandal, exposure. A man who had faked his disappearance could not afford even a whisper of the truth. And now, one more visit would be needed. The cottage on Millthorpe Lane was not empty after all, and Miss Marple was ready to knock. Chapter 8. The Man Who Was Supposed to Be Gone. The cottage on Millthorpe Lane was a place most villagers forgot was even there. Nestled behind a copse of overgrown ash trees, it sat sunken into its own shadow, ivy draped thickly over its worn brick walls, like an old cardigan clinging to brittle shoulders. Long ago it had belonged to Miss Fenton, a retired schoolmistress, known for her stern poetry readings and even sterner sponge cake. Since her passing, it had passed into quiet disuse, the windows shuttered, the curtains unmoved. But now it held a far less innocent occupant. Miss Marple approached the gate just before dusk, when the hush of evening pressed down on the village, and the scent of wood smoke drifted through chimneys like memory. She paused outside the crumbling stone wall, noting fresh boot prints in the mossy grass leading to the front door, heavy, broad, male. She knocked once. Silence. Twice. Still nothing. And then, as she reached forward a third time, the curtain on the side window gave the slightest twitch. Miss Marple did not smile nor step back. She simply adjusted the angle of her umbrella and said, clearly but without raising her voice, I know you're in there, Mr. Crocombe. You may as well open the door. I believe we've both waited long enough. A pause followed. A long, quivering silence. Then the bolt on the other side scraped open with a reluctant groan, and the door cracked just wide enough to show a single wary eye. It was Edgar Crocombe. Older now, of course. The once full-cheeked village handyman had thinned to a ghostly silhouette of himself. His beard was patchy and gray, his eyes set deep in a sallow face lined with years of fear and bitterness. But Miss Marple recognized him at once. There are some men whose character is imprinted not in their flesh, but in the stillness with which they watch the world pass. Miss Marple, he rasped, voice like gravel stirred by wind. I wondered when you'd find me. You've caused quite a stir, she said softly, stepping forward as he opened the door wider. Though I imagine you didn't mean to. He led her inside without comment. The air inside the cottage was stale, thick with old dust, and something faintly metallic. The sitting room was barely lit, only a single oil lamp casting long shadows across a table stacked with unopened letters and week-old newspapers. The fireplace was dark. On a small camping stove sat a whistling kettle no one seemed eager to attend to. She did not remove her coat. She did not sit. "You returned 6 months ago," she said. "In secret. No announcement. No explanation. Why?" Edgar scratched his temple, then moved a small pile of mail from a rickety chair and eased himself down. "I didn't come back. I snuck back. Difference." "Difference noted," Miss Marple replied. "But why come at all?" He poured himself a mug of tea from the kettle but didn't offer her any. "Because I had nowhere else to go. My past finally caught up with me abroad. Some old loans came calling, so I came back to the only place where my face had once meant something." "To the wife who told the village you were dead?" He looked up. "She had to. What choice did she have?" "I left her a mess. No money, no explanations. Just vanished in the night like a coward. And well, she got on with it. She built a name for herself. I didn't come back to ruin that. I came back to disappear." "Then why buy Miss Fenton's old cottage in your name?" He shifted. "I didn't use my name, not at first. She handled the deed. It was meant to stay quiet. But she needed the property in some official sense for her pension transfer. The old records had to match. I told her it was a risk." "And Mr. Prothero found out?" Edgar's eyes darkened. "Yes, of course he did. Man couldn't leave a puzzle unsolved." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "He threatened you?" "He didn't need to. He hinted. Left little notes in my gate. Said things like, 'Ghosts are rarely content to stay buried,' or, 'The hive remembers.' That was his style. Clever, quiet, never direct." "And so you visited him?" Edgar gave a bitter laugh. "No. He came to me. 3 nights before he died. Said he'd compiled a file. Said if he were ever found dead, it would be discovered, or worse, mailed. He called it a last sting. I told him I didn't want trouble, that I'd disappear again. But I think that only confirmed his suspicions." Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. "Did he mention what was in the file?" "He didn't say names, but I saw it in his eyes. It wasn't just me. There were others." She waited a moment, then asked quietly, "Did you kill him, Mr. Crocombe?" He looked at her, mouth twisting. "No, I swear it. I wanted to. Oh, I thought about it. But poison? In tea? That's not my way. And he wouldn't have accepted anything from me. No one saw me at the party. I wasn't even there. But someone else was," Miss Marple said. "Someone who also knew about the file." He hesitated. "Lydia." Miss Marple said nothing. "She came by 2 nights before it happened. I don't know how she found out I was here, but she warned me. Said Lionel had asked her brother Thomas odd questions, said he was pressing around her apiary. She thought he was planning to accuse them publicly. Something about improper chemical misuse of land grants." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Did she mention the pesticides?" "She mentioned amitraz. Said Lionel had seen her labels. Asked her how carefully she was diluting. Said she was treating the bees like test subjects. And, what did she say? She said..." He broke off, staring at his empty mug. "She said she'd handle it." Silence thickened in the cottage. A beetle crawled along the windowsill, unnoticed. Miss Marple stood. "If what you say is true, Mr. Crocombe, then Lydia may not be as innocent as she claims." Edgar rubbed his temple. "She's clever, Miss Marple. Cold, but clever. The kind who understands just how much poison won't be detected. And she'd never act out of passion. She'd act because it was necessary to protect her brother, or her land, or her pride." Miss Marple moved to the door. "The police will come soon. You should prepare for that. Will you tell them about me? I'll tell them what they need to know." The walk back to Ivy Cottage was long and darkening. The street lamps now flickered on one by one, casting golden halos on the cobblestones. At her gate, Miss Marple paused, looking toward the direction of the beekeeper's lodge. Even now, the hives must still hum with their steady industry, their queen ruling unseen, her presence felt in the trembling of every wing. And inside one of those hives, perhaps, a file waited. A last sting. She made one final visit that night, to Inspector Cray. He listened carefully as she laid out Edgar Crocombe's confession, the implication of Lydia's knowledge, and the thread of motive that ran, not through anger or inheritance, but through quiet, lethal self-preservation. "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that Mr. Prothero placed the file not in his study, but somewhere no one would think to look, somewhere natural but impenetrable to those afraid of bees." Cray leaned back. "The hives." "Exactly. And you're certain Lydia Debenham knew?" "She knew where he kept things. She knew his patterns. And I believe she visited that shed before the tea began, not during the party chaos, but before, to leave him a cup of tea, precisely as he liked it. Sweet, milky, with a dash of something quite deadly." Cray tapped his pen. "Then we'll need to search the hives." "You'll need a suit," Miss Marple replied, "and a steady hand." The next morning a file was indeed discovered beneath, the false bottom of Hive 3, wrapped in beeswax paper and stamped with Prothero's initials. Inside were 5 names, dates, allegations, photos, and a list of notes from Prothero's last months, each line a quiet, damning record of lives, carefully observed. Near the end of the file, one final entry: "I may not survive this, but the bees will keep my truth until someone dares to reach into the swarm." Miss Marple, upon reading it, sighed. Meddenham St. Mary was a quiet place, but even in the quietest of gardens, the deadliest stings came not from those who buzzed, but from those who watched and waited, perfectly still. Chapter 9. The Queen in the Hive. The file found in Hive 3 changed everything. Inspector Cray had read through the pages 3 times before he spoke. Miss Marple watched him from the small wooden chair in the beekeeper's lodge kitchen, once tidy, now scattered with notes, gloves, and the faint scent of beeswax and lavender oil. The papers were damning. 5 villagers were named, though not all in equal measure. There were accusations of fraud, misuse, of community funds, improper pesticide storage, and one particularly cryptic entry. LD, deliberately endangered hives to eliminate Prothero's strain, denied requests for transparency, displays clinical detachment. Dangerous? Miss Marple, hands folded neatly on her handbag, watched the inspector as he returned the final page to the folder. "She used her knowledge precisely," she said softly. "She knew the bees would protect the file. No one but Lionel Prothero would dare to tuck anything beneath an active hive. He believed in the symbolic as much as the practical." Cray rubbed his eyes. "And Lydia Debenham?" "She knew the file existed. I believe Mr. Crocombe is telling the truth when he says she warned him Prothero was planning to name others. She wanted the file found eventually, just not until after it could no longer damage anyone she cared about. Or herself." Cray leaned back, frowning. "But poisoning him? That's a step beyond protecting one's livelihood. It's murder." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but not hot-blooded, and not impulsive. Quite the opposite. It was done methodically, with full understanding of symptoms and time of effect. She didn't just kill Mr. Prothero, Inspector. She scheduled his death." Cray looked over the file again. "We still don't have direct proof." "No," said Miss Marple, "but we have something better. Intent, and her next actions will tell us everything." Miss Marple did not return directly home. Instead, she made her way along the side path behind the vicarage, through the narrow footpath that wound toward the Debenham property. The clouds were low, the air thick with a warning of rain, and in the distance thunder murmured like a restless conscience. At the apiary, she found Lydia Debenham crouched near the hive bases, her hands busy with a soft brush and her mouth tight, with focus. Her dog, an old collie named Tansy, lifted its head at Miss Marple's approach but did not bark. Lydia didn't look up. "I thought you'd be by," she said. "I thought you might," Miss Marple replied, resting against the fence. I've always admired bees, so orderly, so loyal to the queen, but even a hive, when threatened, turned savage. Lydia stood slowly. You found the file. I didn't, Miss Marple said. The police did. I merely guided them. Of course you did. Lydia wiped her hands on her apron. You always do. Quietly, with that little smile. You never accuse, Miss Marple. You wait for others to condemn themselves. I find people are rather efficient at it. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the bees move between comb and clover. I didn't do it to protect myself, Lydia said suddenly. That's what they'll assume. That I was covering up something. But I didn't. It wasn't about the chemicals or the grants. It was about him. Your brother? She nodded. Thomas isn't strong, not like people think. Prothero was going to destroy him. Not with a gun or a knife, but with paper. With that file. He was going to reveal that Thomas had forged parts of our pesticide purchase records. Not for profit, but to cover up errors, honest mistakes. But the council would never believe that. They'd have stripped our subsidy. The farm would have failed. And Thomas, he would have folded. I couldn't let that happen. Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. So you decided who lived and who didn't. Lydia's face was pale, lips pressed tight. It was a calculated risk. I brewed the tea that morning. I had access to everything. I left it in the shed just before the guests arrived. I knew his habits. He always took a private cup after showing guests his hives, and I knew no one would notice. It wasn't dramatic. No blood, no confrontation. Just a man slumped over his notes. Miss Marple's voice did not rise. And the bees? A beautiful irony, Lydia said, almost smiling. He trusted them to guard his secrets, and they did. Until it was too late. Miss Marple exhaled softly. I understand, you know. Lydia's gaze flicked to hers, sharp and searching. Do you? I've seen many types of crime in my day. Crimes of greed, of passion, of fear. But the ones that stay with me are crimes of calculation. When someone decides coldly that another life is the price of silence. They are always neat, always tidy, but always lonely. Lydia's hands trembled slightly. I suppose this is the part where you call the inspector. Miss Marple shook her head. No, that's already done. They stood like that for a long time, until the soft roll of a car engine grew louder. Inspector Craze Morris came into view, tires crunching slowly over the dirt lane. He stepped out, his expression unreadable, and moved toward the apiary. Fence. Miss Debenham, he said quietly. We'd like you to come with us. There are questions. Lydia did not argue. She unpinned her beekeeping apron, laid it carefully over the fence, and followed him without a word. Miss Marple remained behind, watching the bees. They moved in endless, graceful cycles, building, gathering, guarding, a community in perfect order, until it was disturbed. Until the queen, unseen but absolute, made a decision, and the hive obeyed. Later that evening, Meddenham St. Mary returned to its well-rehearsed quiet. The beekeeper's lodge had been shuttered again, the last of the officers gone. Mrs. Crowcombe resumed her duties at the post office, face pale but composed. Colonel Hargreaves attended the Sunday service, sitting 2 rows back from the front instead of his usual seat. And Thomas Debenham, though not arrested, was no longer seen at the Blue Boar, but Miss Marple, ever thoughtful, returned once more to the lodge garden, now empty of guests and questions. She stood before the hives, hands folded, and whispered, a single sentence to the wind. Even queens can fall if they sting once too often. Then turning away, she walked the path home, her steps soft, her thoughts heavy, and the village, for now, at peace once more. Chapter 10. The Sting in the Silence. The trial of Lydia Debenham occurred 4 months later at the county assizes in Maidstone. The newspapers called it the apiarist's murder and splashed her pale, unsmiling face across headlines for weeks. Her demeanor, precise, composed, clinical, was interpreted by many as guilt born of calculation. To others, She was a woman who had taken on too much responsibility in a man's world and paid the price for protecting her family. The evidence presented was circumstantial but damning. Her knowledge of pesticides, her opportunity to prepare the tea, and her familiarity with Lionel Prothero's habits. The toxicology report had confirmed the presence of amitraz in the cup, and her fingerprints were found on the tin hidden in the compost. What saved her from the gallows, in the end, was not legal maneuvering, but Miss Marple's quiet testimony, delivered, without fanfare, in her usual gentle tone. "I do not condone what Miss Debenham did," she said to the court, "but I understand it. She did not act for gain. She acted from fear that her brother's life and the livelihood of their family would be torn apart. Mr. Prothero knew how to provoke that fear." The jury deliberated for 2 hours and returned a verdict of manslaughter. Lydia was sentenced to 12 years. She accepted the judgment with her usual stillness, looking neither relieved nor devastated. And so the matter passed, as all things must, into the realm of village memory. But for Miss Marple, the case did not end with the sentencing. 2 weeks after the trial, the vicar's wife invited Miss Marple to tea, a subdued affair, held in the bright corner of the rectory's sunroom. Mrs. Chiswell, all nerves and over-poured cream, was desperate to talk about anything but the murder. "I do hope things return to normal soon," she fretted. "The harvest fair is coming up and everyone's so, well, guarded. The colonel hasn't been to services in 3 Sundays. And poor Thomas Debenham, he walks like he's underwater." "Grief changes people," Miss Marple said gently. "Do you think she'll ever return?" "Lydia?" Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Possibly. Someday. Though it will take years for the hive to forget the sting." Mrs. Chiswell blinked, not quite following. "People," Miss Marple added kindly, "are not unlike bees. They're quick to protect, slow to forgive, and always working beneath the surface, but they remember." That evening, Miss Marple returned to Ivy Cottage and took out her writing box. Inside was the only souvenir she had kept from the affair, a single page from Prothero's secret file. It was the final entry. "I misjudged her. She does not sting out of vanity or vengeance, but out of protection. That makes her infinitely more dangerous. I shall seal this and keep it where no one will find it but the truly observant." She placed the page back into its envelope and tucked it away. The rest of the file had been submitted to Inspector Cray. Names had been redacted, reputations shielded, at Miss Marple's gentle insistence. There had been enough damage. The truth had been found. Justice, in its own imperfect way, had been served, and yet even now she could hear the soft hum of bees in her thoughts. Industrious, tireless creatures, loyal to their queen, but always ready to defend the hive, no matter the cost. On the first Sunday of Advent, Miss Marple visited the lodge one last time. The new owners had moved in, a young couple from Cambridge with no memory of Prothero or the village's scandals. They'd repainted the shed, cleared the garden, and dismantled the hives. The bees, they said, had grown too aggressive. They wanted roses instead. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the lawn, her parasol resting on her shoulder, and watched as the empty hive boxes were carted away. She did not say goodbye. Bees do not mourn. They simply move on, rebuild, and protect the next generation of queens. And Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, turned back toward the village lane. The world, she knew, would always contain its share of venom, but it would all weigh